What's up everybody? Ronald here with a quick start guide on how to optimize your computer performance and graphics settings to get the most out of your games and your gaming hardware. Now specifically this is for Tarkov, however this can apply to basically any game. Once you have your gaming settings and performance settings optimized, you should notice more frames per second for sure, and maybe even lower ping depending upon how hard your computer was working before you did any of these steps. Now this guide is going to apply to any level of CPU or any level of graphics card. It's not just aimed at people with high-end hardware, it's aimed with people who have budget builds as well. So basically everyone should be able to get at least something out of this. Before we get started, please take a moment to comment down below after the video and let me know if there's other things that I've missed or if there's other things that you'd like to see us make additional videos about how to optimize. And also just how you like this. Was this helpful or not? It really helps kind of guide the direction of the content that we make for our community. Please join the Xfil Discord where we have a large and thriving community of Tarkov players going that are there to help you get better at the game, or maybe you can help someone else get better at the game. And lastly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our updates coming on any of our shows. All right, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the importance of updating your graphics drivers and your chipset drivers if you have a Ryzen processor. Now specifically, this comes in the form of going out to the website and always making sure that you have the right and most current drivers. And why this matters is because you can actually install Windows generically, meaning you can run the installer off of a CD or off of an ISO image or off of a USB stick, or if you can buy it from like Best Buy or Tiger Direct or Amazon or somewhere like that, it can come to you and they may have just installed a generic load of Windows which isn't necessarily optimized for the hardware that you're running on. So there's a couple of things that you always want to make sure that you've done. Now I'm going to specifically start by talking about AMD's Ryzen processors, and we're going to start there. The first thing is to go to amd.com/en/support, and what you're going to find is AMD makes the Radeon graphics cards and they obviously make Ryzen processors. So you want to go out there and make sure that you pull down the current version of driver if you have a Radeon graphics card that matches your card. Make sure you have the newest and updated version. But then you want to go to chipset. If you have an AMD Ryzen chip in your computer, you want to go to chipsets and make sure that you go out and pull down the current version of the Windows drivers for your processor. Now I know this sounds a little bit weird to people who are not super familiar with how Windows drivers work, but Windows actually uses drivers not only for your graphics card, but also for your processor as well. AMD has written some specific drivers that leverage the most out of the hardware that they've put into their CPUs and allow Windows to take full advantage of it. So what you want to do is figure out which processor you have. In my particular case, we'll start with the AM4 chipset, which is the X570, which is what I have. There's 3 different drivers that come up, and I want to make sure that I pull down the AMD chipset drivers. These are the ones that you want to make sure that if you have a Ryzen processor, you download, you install, and you run them. It's going to install in the background. It's really not going to change anything visible. You don't get a fancy icon. You don't really get anything else other than this installs in the background, and it's the first step to building that really efficient and performance optimized PC on the Ryzen platform. So once you're done with that, and if you have a Radeon graphics card, you've updated your graphics drivers from AMD's website, you can go ahead and get rid of this. Now, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you're going to want to go over to nvidia.com, click on drivers and Geforce drivers, and find your graphics card in the list and download the latest driver. Now, NVIDIA has a totally different way of going about this. They're going to install something called the Geforce Experience on your computer. And the Geforce Experience is going to be an application that will manage your video card driver. And what that allows you to do is you can automatically update your driver with the Geforce Experience. You can reinstall your driver. Sometimes what can happen is when you're playing around with settings in game, you can corrupt something in your driver and something starts not to work right. And with the Geforce Experience application, you can reinstall your driver, which is actually kind of a big deal when it comes to troubleshooting. It's one of the first things you want to try if you're experiencing a lot of screen tearing and desyncs and those kinds of things. You might want to try reinstalling your driver. Now there's another side note here for those of you that also create content. NVIDIA actually has two different drivers. One is the game ready driver, which is optimized for Tarkov or for other games. And one is the studio driver, which is optimized for creating content, much like the video that you're watching now. I run the game driver on my personal PC that I also create content on because the game driver can do both, but you may want to try the studio driver if there's something that you're trying to do that you can't do. So the next thing I want to talk about is your power settings. And these become very important when you realize kind of all the different things that happen in the background of your computer and how Windows needs to know what you really want to do with your computer's power settings. So the first thing you want to do is go to your start menu and type power, and it'll come up with power and sleep settings, and it'll pop up a window that looks like this. There's two things you really want to change. If you leave your computer on all the time, you may want to consider changing the sleep. I have my computer set to never go to sleep, and that's because what this does is it takes the computer and puts it in kind of a halfway shutdown mode, and I never want that. I want my computer to always be running at its full potential all the time. And it does do this after it's been idle for a while, but I never want to run into a situation where Windows gets confused and I'm in a long session of gaming for a couple hours and the computer can go to sleep because Windows thinks something weird is happening or whatever. And that's unlikely, but it can happen, so I just leave that off. The top setting is screen, and this is when it blacks out your screen or darks out your screen to save your screen from getting burn in. I leave mine set at 2 hours because I don't mind having a lot of idle time before my screen goes black. These are basic settings, but where the true optimization comes with power is when you click on additional power settings, and it pulls up this menu that you can choose or customize a power plan for your PC. Now, when you have a Ryzen computer and you go to AMD's website and you install those Ryzen chipset drivers, you're going to end up with something called the AMD Ryzen High Performance Plan. If you run a Ryzen computer, this is what you want to have checked all the time. Do not try to create your own. Do not use the AMD Ryzen Balanced. Use the AMD Ryzen Performance High Performance Plan. What this does is it optimizes things like how your cores are used on your processor. It optimizes how Windows schedules programs to be run on a different core. And all of this stuff is really technical that happens in the background that AMD knows that there is a certain group of people that are buying their processors for gaming or for content creation or for anything else that is a lot of high workload. They know that they had to have something that would leverage everything you can do with your processor. And that's what this is for. This is the high performance. If you do end up using the balanced, what this is going to favor is a more of a power saving approach. And the way that you save power with processors is you decrease the amount of workload they can do. Well, you do not want to use balance because what balance means is that your power supply will use a little bit less power, but really not enough to make a huge difference at all in your power bill, but it will greatly reduce the performance of your PC. So you always want to have high performance for AMD Ryzen checked if you have an AMD card. Now, what if you have an Intel chip? If you have an Intel chip in your computer, you simply want to check high performance. This is a default Windows power plan that is available to everybody and is optimized for Intel and will work just fine. You want to check high performance for Intel, AMD Ryzen high performance for AMD Ryzen. Now, the next thing that we want to check is we want to check to make sure that the fancy gaming monitor that we bought is actually running at 144 megahertz or 120 megahertz. Or in some cases, you may have a monitor that will run at 240 megahertz. Whatever speed that is, we want to make sure that your monitor is running at the appropriate megahertz, because if it's not, your frames are going to be capped at the megahertz. So most monitors run at 60 hertz, which means that they're capped at 60 frames. So what we want to do is check that by right-click and say desktop. This will pull up a window that will pull up your displays. Now, my particular computer has 3 displays on it. I want to scroll down to the bottom and find where it says Advanced Display Settings. And when I click on Advanced Display Settings, there's a refresh rate that shows up here, and it's set to 144 because I've done this in the past. If yours says 59 or 60, you want to click on Display Adapters for Display 1. You want to click on monitor, and there's a drop-down box here for refresh rate. And you want to make sure that that refresh rate is set to 144 or 120, whatever the highest refresh rate that your monitor can support. That's the one you want to have it set to. And when you do that, that's a very easy way to increase your frames, because you think about it like this. Your computer may have the capability of giving you a lot more FPS, but because your monitor is being limited by the amount of megahertz refresh that it has, it's just not able to push the monitor far enough to give you that really crisp display. So once that's done, you click OK, you click OK. The next thing I want to talk about is memory speed. And memory speed is an interesting thing, because we all go out, we buy somewhat decent to high-end gaming computers, and we get our fast DDR4 memory right now, which is what's current. And then we go in, we put it all together, and the computer boots and runs just fine, but then our memory is running slow, or we have the perception that our memory is running slow. And I want to show you how to check what your memory speed is doing. When you go into Task Manager in Windows and you pull up Task Manager, you click on the Performance tab, and then you click on Memory. And then in the bottom of this window, there is a section called Speed, Slots Used, Form Factor, all this stuff down here. Speed is what you're looking for. Now, I have 3600 megahertz memory that's not overclocked. I do not overclock my memory. I leave it running at a standard speed, and my memory is running at 3600 megahertz. And when you know that your memory in your BIOS is set to run at the correct speed, it will reflect that in Windows. So how did this happen? When I first installed my computer, when I put in the memory, installed Windows, and booted it for the first time, Windows said something like 1800 megahertz or 2100 megahertz. And I know that that's incorrect. So I had to go into my BIOS, and again, this is on Ryzen specific. I had to go into my BIOS, and unfortunately, every motherboard manufacturer is a little bit different. So what you're going to have to do, if you need to do this, is you're going to have to Google your motherboard model and then the letters XMP profile. And there will be a setting in your BIOS somewhere in the advanced settings to enable XMP memory profile. And when you do that, that will change a bunch of technical settings on your motherboard that will allow your memory to run at its full speed. And when you boot back into Windows, you can tell that you were successful, because you'll see your correct speed inside of Task Manager in the Performance tab under Memory. Now, there's one other thing I want to highlight inside of Task Manager under Performance, and that's the CPU tab. And one of the things we just talked about were power settings. And one of the things you'll notice when you have the correct high performance power setting enabled for your PC is your speed that your processor runs at will not fluctuate back and forth, back and forth. When you have a balanced power plan enabled, or a low performance or a low power consumption power plan, you will constantly see your processor speed dive down to 1 gigahertz or even below if it's just idling. It's constantly going to be ramping up and ramping down, ramping up and ramping down to try to save power. And this, of course, plays havoc when you're messing with game settings or you're trying to run a game, because the game gets confused and the processor starts causing the game to have problems because it's not a consistent speed. It's not taking data at a consistent rate. So that's one of the major issues that happens with power settings. And when you set to high performance, your chip is set to its highest performance static setting. In my particular case, my computer is set at 4.2 gigahertz, and so I run at 4.16 gigahertz all day, all the time, and it's not a problem. Now, the next thing I want to look at is specifically for processors, for the AMD Ryzen processors. AMD has this software package called the AMD Ryzen Master software. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to have a couple of presets which are safe. They will not blow up your computer. They will not melt your motherboard. They're safe to use for just the average everyday gamer who wants to do different things with their computer. And you'll see a lot of guides online on YouTube and a lot of different places say you need to use the Ryzen Master software. And then, at least in my personal experience, I've seen people give really super detailed explanations of what all these different buttons do. And that's great, but a lot of the times I've just wanted to know like the 15-second answer and then keep going. And so what I want to give you is here are just really the two options, what they mean and how this package works, the software package works, and you can just kind of use one of these two things and then you'll be fine for like 95% of what people are doing. Ryzen Master comes with basically two preset modes, creator mode and game mode. Now what game mode does is on a Ryzen, it takes half of the cores and disables them. And you may think to yourself, why would I want that? Or why does that sound a little bit counterintuitive? Well, it turns out that some games run better actually when you have less cores enabled. And so AMD figured this out and they created a preset that if you're experiencing an issue, which if you're using a modern Ryzen processor, you're probably not, but if you are experiencing an issue, you can check game mode and then check save and apply, reboot your computer, and you're probably going to not have any issues when it comes to your processor performance. Creator mode unlocks all of the cores because in creator mode, if you're going to be doing things like rendering YouTube videos or recording YouTube videos or whatever, you want to have as much horsepower running as possible. So creator mode kind of opens the floodgates for all of the different possibilities for use for your processor. You do not need to manage any of these technical settings at all. This is all handled within these two profiles. It's all automatic and everything works great. Now, I personally use creator mode. I game in creator mode and I have no problems at all. I have a Ryzen 9 3950X 16 core processor, and I've never had any issues with creator mode gaming or actually creating content. That's pretty much it for Ryzen Master. It can do a lot of things, but you don't really have to do a lot of things with it to really get the most out of your Ryzen chip. And that's kind of my point. You're going to see a lot of content out there that will give you an hour-long tutorial on how to tweak your CAS write latency. And it just gets really, really confusing, and it really is not necessary. All you have to know is creator mode or game mode, and the main difference is that one disables half the cores if your particular application needs you to do that. All right, let's hop into Tarkov quick, and let's take a look at a couple different settings and go over kind of what they mean and talk about the different levels of video cards and how we can best get the most out of our different video cards at the different setting levels. The first thing we want to do before we really get into this is what we want to do is hit the tilde key, and that's going to bring up a window that looks like this. And you type FPS space and the number 1 and hit enter. Then you hit the tilde key again, and that goes away. Now, if you notice up here, what we see is we see this limit 60, FPS 61, RTT 0, player RTT 0. And basically what we're going to be worrying about here is FPS. So I want to go into settings for Tarkov. I want to click on graphics. And the first thing I want to take a look at is my VSync. You're going to want to have VSync on because with VSync checked, it allows the Tarkov client to actually get above the limit of frames. And we'll see that once we get in game as well. The first thing I want to go over here is texture quality. Now, texture quality is a very interesting thing. You can have a super high-end graphics card, so you may think, well, I'm going to set all my graphics settings to high. You don't necessarily want that because even with a high-end graphics card, the combination of your high-end graphics card and high-end CPU still might not be enough to really render out the amount of graphics that are going to be rendered at super high settings. Now, I set my texture quality at medium because there are a couple different schools of thought about this. Some FPS players will say lower your graphics settings all the way down to 0, as low as you can get them because you want to have as many frames as possible. But what they don't realize is that there's actually diminishing returns on some types of graphic settings, and texture quality is one of those. When you run texture quality at low, you're shifting the burden of the rendering from your graphics card to your CPU. So you can actually slow down performance of your game because your CPU is doing more work than your graphics card. So at medium, it kind of is a good balance between the amount of work that your CPU does and the amount of work that your graphics card does. Shadows quality, I kind of have the same kind of thought about that. I leave it at medium. Now, object LOD quality is an interesting one. I run a very low value here because what this basically means is that it decreases the density of like bushes and trees and things like that at a distance. So when you have this slider all the way kind of on the lowest setting, you are basically telling your game client, don't worry about rendering as many bushes and trees, branches, and things to make the screen look pretty. I want to be able to see people in a distance so I can engage them in PvP, right? So we want to have this all the way down as far as you can, because it'll make it easier basically to spot other players. Overall visibility is something that's very personal preference, so is shadow visibility. It depends upon how you like to see the game rendered on your screen. These 1550 values are what I kind of landed on as my personal preference. Anti-aliasing. Now when it comes to anti-aliasing, here is one very specific setting where you can get a lot of bang for your buck when it comes to frames. When you have anti-aliasing turned on, your graphics card is going to do a lot more work. However, the game will look a whole lot better. Now, I have a high-end graphics card in my computer right now, so I have anti-aliasing set on FXAA. And what that means is that the game gets smoothed out a little bit and the players look a little bit smoother, the edges on the buildings, everything looks a little bit smoother. And for me, I like the way that looks. Now, instead of having the card that I have, let's say I had a more budget card, I would simply turn this off to get more frames out of my card. Resampling, same thing. I leave resampling off. I don't really worry about this setting. HBAO, SSR, these are all have to do with shadow visibility and different kind of rendering options. I leave them off because for my personal preference, I don't really notice a huge difference in the way that the game looks, and so they don't really need to be on for me to enjoy the game, and all they do is decrease the amount of frames that the game is producing. Anisotropic filtering. Now this is another thing that's kind of interesting. If you have a budget graphics card, you can turn this off. I have a high-end graphics card, so I turn it on, and again, I just like the way the game looks with this on. Sharpness. Now sharpness is an interesting thing. It's kind of like anti-aliasing. It makes things stand out kind of at a distance. This is a number you're going to want to play with because things can look a little weird. I'm currently using 0.7, but as you can see, it goes all the way up to 3. I'm kind of settled on 0.7 for my own personal preference, but it can kind of be a poor man's anti-aliasing for making things look sharper in the distance if you have a graphics card that's more in that medium range. Now, when you have VSync enabled, you do not have to do the lobby or game FPS limit. If you'll notice right now, because we have VSync enabled and just the way the Tarkov client works, we're getting 135, 140 frames when the limit is 60 just in the lobby here as we go through the graphics settings menu. Z-blur, motion blurring, those kinds of things basically are when you move your head around in Tarkov if you want to see a blur. I think that looks terrible. I don't want that. Grass shadows, to me, are just more things that have to render on my screen, so I don't necessarily need those to enjoy the game. Now, Tarkov recently added an entirely new section called PostFX. This stuff is very similar to the NVIDIA filters that were around previously, and Tarkov actually asked NVIDIA to disable compatibility with NVIDIA filters because they had this kind of image processing technology coming to the game client itself. Now I'm playing around with this. This is all personal preference. There are people that say that you can spot players better by oversaturating the colors. There are people that say that this is maybe not the best game strategy or that's not fair or whatever. I don't have an opinion on that. All I'm saying is that you can make your game look very different depending upon, in some legitimate cases, if you're colorblind or whatever, but if you're trying to spot people better, play around with these settings. There are many, many different color grading settings, and I'm still haven't gone through all of them myself, and I'm just playing around with them. Okay, a couple of last things here. Tarkov is pretty much optimized now. I want to talk about the peripherals that you're using. Make sure that you research and possibly consider using a mechanical keyboard. Now, mechanical keyboards are a really big deal when it comes to having advantage in FPS games, because the way that most keyboards work, if you think of how a key button push works, when you push your key down and the key hits the bottom, on most keyboards, that's when the signal is sent to the game that you want to do something. So let's say you're looking to crouch or prone or walk forward or strafe. When you push, the key has to get all the way to the bottom, that extra split second for the keyboard to recognize that's what you want to do. On a mechanical keyboard, as soon as it detects that there is motion in the key, so the key is just a little bit been pressed, but not even close to the bottom, that's when the action is performed. And that's a huge, huge advantage in FPS games, because those little bits of just stuttering around can mean the difference between being shot or being avoiding being shot. The next thing is consider getting a high DPI gaming mouse. And what that means is look at the settings for the mouse, or look at the capabilities of the mouse that you're using. And there's two things you really want to look at. One is the DPI of the mouse, meaning how sensitive the mouse is. And the next thing is some of the really high-end mice will have latency ratings for USB, meaning you want to have a very low latent USB mouse that connects to your computer, because if you move your mouse to the right or to the left, you want to make sure that the interpretation of that command happens when you want it to happen, much like a mechanical keyboard. So you want to get yourself a gaming mouse that's high DPI and low USB latency. There's two other things which we'll talk about in different videos, but I want to recognize as being important. You can overclock your graphics card, and you can overclock your CPU. I don't want to get into it in this video, but perhaps if you want me to make a video on those things, leave a comment below and I can make a video on how to do that, and how it kind of can affect your computer, and how it kind of can affect your gaming experience. Because remember, your hardware is designed to run a certain way, so if you start overclocking it, you can introduce instability. However, you can introduce quite a bit more performance as well. It just gets a little bit more technical. Well, that's pretty much it. I want to thank everybody for watching. If you stuck it through to the end, please leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought about this. Let me know if I missed anything or made a mistake. And let me know if there's anything else that you'd like me to make a video on. We're always willing to help everyone get through the transition to their first PC. Or maybe you've had PCs for a long time and you're just getting back into gaming and you're trying to figure out what all the new hardware is. I hope this helps. And if you would like to meet more like-minded gaming folks around Tarkov, please join the Exfil Discord. The link will be in the show notes below. I'll also leave links to the various different places that we covered during this video to get updated graphics drivers and updated CPU drivers. And of course, you can always hit me up directly in the Exfil Discord at Ronald. I'll be at the top of the list with MTBtrigger. Send me a DM if you would like to talk to me directly about anything that you have going on with your computer. And that's pretty much it. Remember to comment and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.